I've always had these wouldn't it be cool if sorts of ideas, right? I've always watched from the sidelines as business, government, and even NGOs weren't really addressing the issue as well as we could. So there I was practicing law, and I remember having a phone conversation with my grandfather, who was a 95-year-old farmer in Saskatchewan at the time. And he was asking me how my practice was going. I was saying, well, it's fine. I'm more interested in this other stuff, though. And if I could only get my hours down to something more 9 to 5, then I could do more of this other stuff. And so he sensed that I wasn't all that happy with what I was doing. And the phone call ended with him saying, you have to enjoy what you're doing, Rob. Do what you love. And I had a client that was coming in shortly. So I said, okay, thanks, and I'll talk to you again soon. And those words lingered for a period. But in any event, that ended up being our last conversation. He passed away 2 weeks later. I then found myself at his funeral in Saskatchewan, and it was, a day or two after everyone had left. And there I was, standing in the cemetery alone. And in front of me, there I am, I'm looking down at the place where my grandfather had just been buried. And to the right of that was where my father had been buried. He had passed away a few years prior. And to the right of that was this empty patch of green grass. And I was standing there, those words kind of running through my head, his last words to me, do what you love. And recognizing that empty patch of green grass was me. That was me. And it's inescapable. That's where we all end up. And so I think something about being in that place really brought home this sense of mortality, the sense of I'm running out of time, the sense of, well, what am I going to do with the time that I have left? What do I value? So I came back to Toronto, and I had all that sort of going in my head, and it was maybe a couple months later that I got an envelope in the mail from Saskatchewan, and I opened it up, and it was a check from my grandfather's estate, and it was a small sum, but I remember when I pulled it out of the envelope and recognized it for what it was, I had this, it was, I basically heard his voice in my head from, 2 months prior, do what you love. And I realized this is a gift. This is something special. And I then decided to take one of these ideas that I just sort of had sitting on the back burner for a while and explore it. That check was essentially the gift of time. It bought me 3 to 4 months. I didn't have to worry about paying my bills. And that afternoon, I went to the law library and I started to do the legal research behind the idea to satisfy myself to answer the question, does a municipality have the legal authority to require these climate change labels on gas pump nozzles? And the more I got into it, the more I thought, yeah, there is a really great argument here for municipal jurisdiction. My background prior to law was in business and economics and psychology. And so the more I looked at the problem through that lens, it's interesting, the idea became more and more compelling. And I realized I had something coming together. I had, notes to myself and a few emails that I sent to myself and a bunch of printed out case law and, like a little recorder device on my phone. And I thought, this is important. I don't know what to do with it though, but this is important. And I thought, well, I could just write a paper, but then it would just live on the internet, and then what? So I started to call around friends, and I asked 3 friends to be on my board of directors so I can incorporate a nonprofit that would then be the vehicle through which I would advocate for this idea. And so that happened. So that's how Our Horizon was born. So I had booked a venue in downtown Toronto, a little art gallery, to have as a launch. We were going to have a launch event there, and the idea was to have these foam core panels in a gallery where one would speak to the nature of the problem, one would speak to the idea. There'd be a panel on some of the psychology behind it, some of the economic theory, its impact, and so on. And then at the end, there was this call to action. If people liked the idea, they can contact their counselors to advocate for it. And so I booked that space to be a bit of a firm deadline, so I would ensure that, wheels would be in motion, this thing would actually be launched. And it was about 2 weeks before launch that I realized I don't think I have enough time to do everything that I need to do to sort of get this thing off the ground, build a website, design these panels and so on. And so I thought, I've got a 45-minute door-to-door commute. So an hour and a half a day was spent on the streetcar. Multiply that out by 7 days a week, which is what I was working on this project. That's like 10 and a half hours a week times, the 2 weeks to launch. That's a lot of time, right? Spent commuting. And so in the 2 weeks to launch, I basically went back home, loaded up my hockey bag full of clothing, brought a camping mat and a sleeping bag to work, and I slept on the floor of my office for the 2 weeks before launch. And we made it. It was maybe like an hour or so before everyone was expected to show up for the opening, that the panels arrived and we had volunteers put them up and everything. And it's been go, go, go ever since. We actually don't have funding. It's incredibly challenging for a nonprofit without charitable status to raise money. So at first, that check from my grandfather, it bought me 3 to 4 months, but that only lasted for so long. I then started to dip into my savings. There was a period that I did hire a couple of friends to help me with some work. My savings, though, eventually I depleted that. So then I started to rely on my line of credit, which is now maxed. And now I'm basically almost living off of a credit card, which that's going to run out pretty soon. How I've been able to make ends meet, though, is I own a property on the north end of town that I rent out to someone. And for 3 years, I've been living in a small basement apartment. Recently, I just moved into a smaller room where I've got a bunch of roommates. But that difference between rental income in and rent money going out has enabled me to volunteer full-time on this project for 3 years. And I'm actually quite privileged to be able to do it, that I do own a home that I'm able to effectively monetize to earn an income so that I can do this work. But I think to myself, how much further ahead I would be if I actually did have a budget. If I were able to hire 2 or 3 staff, this thing would be light years ahead. But I mean, I guess I did what I had to do to kind of get this thing off the ground. And it went from just an idea, just a doodle on my desk, to it now exists. It's being passed into law. And the hope is, anyway, that soon I'll get just enough support that I'm able to have a small team to push this out to the world. Well, I've had to be really creative. I think if you don't have a budget, you have to be creative. One example, so I was in Victoria, I was about to give a lecture at the law school there, and just before giving, so I had a place to stay. It was with a former classmate, and just before giving the lecture, I got a text. She said her 2 kids are sick with the flu, and she doesn't want me to spend the night there because she's worried that I might get sick, and then I'm on the road for several weeks, and I don't want to be sick, right? So okay, fine. So I continue. I start my lecture, continue. I finish, and then someone asks, okay, well, this is interesting. How do we get this going here? And I'm like, well, there's a series of steps, but the first step is I kind of need a place to spend the night. The place where I was staying at, I can't stay there anymore. And so a couple hands shot up, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Now I've got a couch to sort of sleep on. The next day I found myself at Nanaimo, at Vancouver Island University, and I gave a lecture to, I don't know, maybe 75 to 100 people there. And I actually inserted a picture of a couch in my PowerPoint slideshow, which was one of the final slides. And I said, I don't have a place to spend the night tonight. Does anyone have a couch for me to crash on? 10 hands shot up. An hour later, I'm drinking homebrew with a bunch of undergrad students, and we're playing cards. So it hasn't all been bad. It's been kind of fun. Not having a budget forces you to be creative. And I've actually met Canadians coast to coast, just randomly couch surfing. It's been a super cool adventure. Yeah. I do believe that 3 years from now, these climate change labels will exist on gas pumps all over the world. In my mind, it's inevitable. It's almost already happened. It's just a matter of time catching up to that eventuality. So the game plan is plug away for 3 more years. At that time then, they will exist in countries all over the world. More than that though, they won't require someone to constantly be pushing it. It'll just then be one of many ideas that governments can pursue to accelerate this transition away from fossil fuels. And my plan is to close up shop and move on to something else. I think I might go traveling. I would love to just strap a backpack onto my back and leave. I'm not even sure where I would go yet. I think it would involve some surfing. The other plan, I love the idea of farming. My grandfather was a farmer. My dad grew up on a farm. And I like the idea of working every day, using my hands, my body to grow food for me, you know, for my family, for my community, and being tired, being physically exhausted at the end of the day, reading a book, you know, before bed, and doing it again the next day, you know, repeat, die. Like I can totally do that, and I would be happy doing that. Yeah.